In 1984, the Arizona desert gave up a terrible secret: the body of a young college student, abandoned in a lonely wash. Her case went cold for more than 3 decades, until a shocking arrest shattered an entire neighborhood. She left a diner one night in Mesa, Arizona, and never made it home. For years, her family prayed for answers. What they didn't know was that her killer was hiding in plain sight. It started as a mystery in the desert: a missing student, a car left abandoned, a community consumed by fear. What followed was one of Arizona's most haunting cold cases. Imagine waiting nearly 40 years to learn the truth about your daughter's murder. For the Lopez family, that nightmare was real, and the secret that finally surfaced stunned everyone. A body in the desert, a vanished future, and a mystery that refused to die. This is the story of how a 1984 Arizona cold case was finally solved. But before we dive into the story, hit the subscribe button. On a dry spring morning in April 1984, the Arizona sun had not yet burned away the night's chill. The desert east of Phoenix stretched in muted tones of beige and rust, its scattered mesquite trees and brittle sagebrush standing in quiet witness to the decades of solitude that had shaped this land. It was the kind of morning when the stillness seemed endless, until it wasn't. Shortly after 7 a.m., a man named Harold McKinney, an amateur hiker who often took to the washes and arroyos for exercise, parked his pickup truck along a dusty service road near Apache Junction. He slung a canteen over his shoulder and headed toward a trail he knew well, a path that wound past the remnants of old mining claims, half buried in the sand and stone of the Superstition foothills. Just half a mile in, McKinney's morning was shattered. At the base of a shallow wash, tangled in tumbleweed and half covered in sand, lay something that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was a mannequin, a discarded prop or trash dumped from the roadside. But as he climbed closer, the truth became undeniable. It was a body. The woman lay face down, one arm bent unnaturally under her torso, her clothing torn and dirt-stained. The desert wind stirred her long, dark hair across her shoulders. She appeared young, barely into adulthood. There were marks on her wrists and bruising along her arms. McKinney froze. For a moment, he considered that this could be an accident. Perhaps she had fallen, lost in the desert heat. But the cool air told him otherwise. This woman had not been lying here for long, yet her stillness was absolute. He scrambled back up the embankment and hurried to his truck, his heart pounding. Within 15 minutes, Pinal County Sheriff's deputies were converging on the scene. Radios crackled with clipped urgency. The desert, normally so quiet, now hummed with engines, footsteps, and low voices. Yellow tape went up, cutting the barren wash into a stage of tragedy. The woman would later be identified as Maria Lopez, 21 years old, a student at Mesa Community College. Maria lived with her parents in a modest neighborhood on the eastern edge of Phoenix. She was the second of 4 children in a close-knit Mexican-American family. Friends described her as diligent, warm, and ambitious, a young woman who dreamed of becoming a teacher. The night before her body was found, Maria had gone out with classmates to a local diner off Main Street. Witnesses remembered her leaving around 10:30 p.m., saying she needed to drive home early because she had an exam the next day. She never made it back. Her car, a faded blue 1976 Toyota Corolla, was later discovered abandoned in a supermarket parking lot, just a few miles from her home. The doors were locked. The keys were missing. The Arizona of 1984 was a state in the midst of change. Phoenix was growing rapidly, swelling into the desert with new subdivisions and strip malls. However, the landscape still featured vast stretches of isolation, where the law could seem distant and the desert could conceal secrets. Crime in the Phoenix metropolitan area was on the rise. Drug trafficking routes snaked through the state, and violent crime rates were climbing. Yet Apache Junction and the Superstition Mountains were still seen as semi-rural, a place where neighbors knew one another, where the desert was more likely to swallow old relics than to give up new horrors. Maria's death struck like a lightning bolt. At the crime scene, detectives noted several telling details. Maria's shoes were missing. Her blouse was torn at the shoulder. There were ligature marks on her wrists and faint bruising around her neck. The desert floor, hardened by years of drought, offered little in the way of footprints. But deputies did find a set of tire impressions leading away from the wash, deep grooves suggesting a heavy vehicle had been there recently. Nearby, in the brush, a single beer bottle glinted in the sunlight. Dust clung to its surface, but the bottle cap was still in place. Investigators carefully bagged it as evidence. By late afternoon, the medical examiner arrived. His early assessment was grim. Maria Lopez had been assaulted and likely strangled. Time of death was estimated at some time between midnight and 3 a.m. News traveled fast. By the evening broadcasts, Phoenix households were hearing of the discovery. Authorities confirmed that the body of a young woman was found early this morning in the desert near Apache Junction. Investigators have identified the victim as 21-year-old Maria Lopez. Sheriff's deputies are treating the case as a homicide. Maria's neighborhood erupted with grief and unease. Families who had long left their doors unlocked began checking their locks twice. For Maria's parents, the shock was unbearable. Her mother, Rosa, wept openly when speaking to reporters. "She was my daughter, my heart. She never hurt anyone. Who could do this?" Detectives fanned out quickly. They began with Maria's classmates, retracing her steps from the diner. The waitress remembered her well, polite, smiling, ordering only a coffee before leaving alone. No one recalled anyone following her outside. Her family told investigators she had no enemies, no disputes. She was not dating anyone seriously at the time. Still, detectives learned of one name that raised their eyebrows. Daniel Harper, a fellow student who had shown interest in Maria in the weeks before her death. Friends said she had been polite but distant with him, unwilling to encourage his advances. Harper, when questioned, denied seeing her the night she vanished. He admitted he liked Maria but insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Detectives noted his nervous demeanor but lacked evidence to press further. The days following the discovery of Maria Lopez's body unfolded in a blur of interviews, evidence collection, and frustration. Detectives with the Pinal County Sheriff's Office and Phoenix PD formed a joint task force. Knowing the case had rattled more than just Maria's family, it had unsettled an entire community. In homicide investigations, the first 48 hours are critical. But as each hour passed, the trail seemed to fade into the desert air. Daniel Harper was 22, tall, lanky, and perpetually disheveled. He studied automotive repair at Mesa Community College, often hanging around the campus parking lot long after his classes ended. Friends described him as awkward and lonely, someone who tried too hard to win people over. Maria's classmates mentioned Harper had been persistent, asking to drive her home, showing up at study sessions uninvited. She was never cruel, but she politely kept her distance. When detectives knocked on Harper's apartment door 2 days after the murder, he answered in a wrinkled t-shirt, his eyes darting nervously. His story was straightforward. He'd been at home the night Maria disappeared, watching television until late. No one could confirm his alibi. Detectives asked about his car, a red Ford pickup. Harper admitted he drove it frequently into the desert to clear his head. The mention of tire tracks found near Maria's body weighed heavily. But when forensic teams compared plaster casts of the impressions with Harper's tires, the grooves didn't match. Still, Harper lingered in the detectives' minds. His nervousness, his interest in Maria, his solitary lifestyle, it all seemed to fit. But evidence was king, and the case lacked it. The lone beer bottle collected near Maria's body seemed promising. Forensic science in 1984 was primitive compared to today. DNA analysis was still years away from mainstream use. Investigators had to rely on fingerprints, fibers, and blood typing. The bottle was dusted for prints. A partial smudge was recovered, but it was too incomplete to match anyone in state databases. Testing the bottle's contents showed only stale beer residue, offering no further leads. What seemed like a potential breakthrough became another frustrating dead end. Police canvassed the area near the supermarket where Maria's car was found. One clerk swore he had seen a young woman matching Maria's description in the parking lot shortly before midnight, speaking with a man beside a large vehicle, maybe a van or a truck, he recalled. The description was vague: dark hair, medium build, jeans. Another witness, a night shift worker, reported hearing what sounded like a heated argument near the same lot. When asked why he hadn't called the police, he shrugged. Arguments happen. Didn't think much of it. The leads pointed toward the possibility that Maria had been approached after leaving the diner, coaxed or forced into another vehicle and driven away. But the trail ended there. Fear crept across Maria's neighborhood. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some whispered about satanic cults, rumored to meet in the desert. Others blamed drug runners who might have mistaken Maria for someone else. Detectives chased every rumor. They interviewed ex-convicts, drug users, and even a transient who camped near the Superstition foothills. None connected. Each false lead consumed precious time. Meanwhile, Maria's funeral drew hundreds. Her classmates filled the pews of the small Catholic church, while neighbors lined the aisles. Father Ramirez, the parish priest, spoke solemnly. Maria was light, taken from us too soon. We pray for justice, though justice feels so far away. In July 1984, just 3 months after Maria's death, another body was discovered in a desert wash, this time near Chandler. The victim, also a young woman, had been strangled. Panic surged. Could a serial predator be at large? Detectives compared both cases. The similarities were striking: desert disposal, signs of restraint, strangulation. But forensic examination revealed differences. The second victim bore stab wounds, something absent in Maria's case. Furthermore, tire impressions at that scene pointed to a different make of vehicle. The possibility of a serial killer was neither confirmed nor ruled out. Yet the theory consumed headlines, drawing attention away from Maria's case. Despite the lack of evidence, suspicion clung to Daniel Harper. Detectives interviewed him multiple times, sometimes pressing him late into the night. Each time, his story remained the same. He was at home, alone, with no witnesses to back him up. Neighbors described Harper as odd but not violent. He kept to himself, said one. Always working on that truck of his. Harper's employer vouched for him as a reliable worker. Still, investigators felt the weight of their own instincts. They drafted a warrant to search his apartment. Inside they found nothing unusual: car magazines, tools, dirty laundry. No trace of Maria, no signs of struggle. The absence of evidence gnawed at detectives. Was Harper guilty but careful? Or were they chasing the wrong man while the Real killer walked free? One of the greatest challenges investigators faced was the limitations of 1984 forensics. DNA typing would not reach U.S. courtrooms until 1987. Fingerprint databases were limited to manual comparisons. Luminol testing for blood traces existed, but often yielded inconclusive results. At the state crime lab, fibers collected from Maria's blouse were examined under a microscope. Analysts noted a few stray synthetic fibers, possibly from vehicle upholstery, but could not match them to a specific make or model. The tire casts, while distinctive, didn't correspond to any known vehicle tied to Harper or other suspects. Detectives were left holding fragments of a puzzle without the picture to guide them. By autumn of 1984, 6 months after Maria's death, the investigation had stalled. Leads dried up. Witnesses' memories blurred. The community, while still shaken, began to move on. For Maria's family, the silence was unbearable. Her father visited the sheriff's office weekly, demanding updates. Her mother, Rosa, kept her daughter's room untouched, her school books still open on the desk. Detectives assured them the case was not forgotten. But inside the department, Maria Lopez's file was gradually pushed further down the stack of unsolved cases. Years passed. Then decades. The Arizona desert is an unforgiving place. It holds its secrets close, swallowing tracks, scattering traces, and masking violence beneath a vast horizon of silence. By early 1985, it seemed Maria Lopez's murder had joined the countless mysteries the desert never meant to give up. In the months after Maria's killing, investigators logged hundreds of hours into her case file. They chased leads across Mesa, Phoenix, and Apache Junction. They cross-referenced reports of suspicious vehicles and revisited every student who had known her. But by the start of 1985, their focus shifted. Phoenix was booming, along with its crime. Violent assaults and homicides were rising with the rapid growth of the metro area. Each new case demanded attention, resources, and manpower. Maria's murder, unsolved and stagnant, slowly slipped from the spotlight. Inside the Pinal County Sheriff's Office, her file was reclassified as cold, a term investigators hated to use. It meant that while the case remained open, active pursuit of leads would dwindle. Detectives rotated to new assignments, and those who had carried Maria's file most closely were reassigned. For Maria's parents, however, the word cold was unbearable. Rosa Lopez never let her daughter's name fade. Each year, on the anniversary of Maria's death, she placed fresh flowers at the desert wash where her body was found. She prayed the rosary, often joined by friends and parishioners, their voices rising against the wind. Her father, Enrique, was less outward in his grief but no less determined. He wrote letters to local officials, begging for updates, urging them not to forget. He kept every newspaper clipping, every sheriff's press release, stored neatly in a shoebox in the closet. For Maria's siblings, the loss was like a shadow cast over their adolescence. Her younger sister, Sophia, once said in a television interview, "We couldn't laugh without remembering her. We couldn't plan for the future without feeling the gap she left. It was like she was always in the room, and never in the room at the same time." Through the late 1980s, sporadic tips arrived. Someone claimed to have seen a man forcing a woman into a truck near the supermarket that night. Another reported overhearing a drunken confession at a bar in Chandler. None of these tips held weight. Each was logged, checked briefly, and eventually dismissed. Without DNA testing, the evidence collected remained stagnant. The blouse fibers, the partial print on the beer bottle, the tire casts, all sat in evidence lockers, their potential untapped. Detectives occasionally pulled the file, revisiting Harper or re-examining reports. Each time, the lack of new technology and leads brought them back to the same conclusion: there was nothing more to be done. By the 1990s, the Lopez family had fractured under the weight of absence. Enrique grew withdrawn, spending hours at work to avoid the silence at home. Rosa turned to her faith, volunteering more at the parish, her grief woven into every prayer she whispered. The siblings struggled in their own ways. Sophia admitted she resented the attention her deceased sister received. The memorials, the interviews, the annual vigils. It felt like Maria was the only child that mattered anymore, she later confessed. The guilt for such feelings only deepened her pain. For the community, the murder became a fading memory. New residents moved into the neighborhood, unaware of the tragedy that had once gripped the block. The desert wash where Maria had been found was gradually overgrown, its history marked only by those who remembered. By the mid-1990s, science was beginning to close the gap that time had widened. DNA profiling, once experimental, was becoming a powerful tool in law enforcement. Cold case units across the country began reopening files, testing old evidence with new technology. But Pinal County was not among the most well-funded departments. Resources were limited, and cases with stronger suspects often took precedence. Maria's evidence boxes remained untouched, waiting for their turn. In 1997, word came of a potential breakthrough. A convicted offender in Nevada, serving time for assault, bore a resemblance to a composite sketch drawn years earlier from vague witness descriptions near the supermarket. Excitement rippled through the Lopez family. Enrique traveled to the sheriff's office in person, pressing detectives to pursue the lead. But within months, the suspect was ruled out. His prison records proved he was incarcerated at the time of Maria's murder. For the family, it was another cycle of hope and despair. By the year 2000, Maria Lopez had been gone 16 years. Her case file contained hundreds of pages of reports, witness statements, and lab notes. But no suspect had been charged. No trial had been held. The desert had moved on. The small service road near Apache Junction, where Maria's body was found, was now busier, with tourists driving toward the Superstition Mountains. The once empty supermarket lot where her car had been abandoned had grown into a shopping plaza. But for the Lopez family, time had not dulled the absence. Maria's mother still prayed for justice. Her father still kept the shoebox of clippings. And her siblings, now grown with families of their own, still avoided speaking of her too long, because to speak of her was to reopen the wound. Inside the Pinal County Sheriff's Office, Maria's file remained on the shelf, one of dozens of unsolved cases. Detectives knew it by name, but newer crimes demanded their focus. Still, some officers quietly could not let it go. Among them was a young detective named Laura Benton, who joined the department in the late 1990s. Fresh out of the academy, Benton had grown up in Phoenix. She had been just a child when Maria was killed. She remembered the news reports, the whispered warnings from parents. Something about Maria's face, the old photos, the unfulfilled life, stayed with her. And Benton quietly made herself a promise. One day, when resources allowed, she would pull the Lopez file again. The story of Maria Lopez did not vanish. It lingered, half-forgotten, in the pages of yellowing reports and boxes of sealed evidence. It waited in the silence of a desert that had seen too many secrets buried beneath its sands. And though no one yet knew it, the dawn of a new millennium would bring with it not only new technology, but a renewed determination. Maria's killer had walked free for 16 years. But time, as investigators would soon learn, can be both an enemy and an ally. The dawn of the 21st century brought more than just new calendars and Y2K paranoia. For law enforcement, it ushered in a revolution in forensic science. DNA testing, once the stuff of experimental labs, was rapidly becoming the cornerstone of modern investigations. Across the country, dusty boxes of evidence were being pried open, long-dormant cases jolted awake by the promise that science could finally answer what memory, rumor, and witness testimony could not. For Maria Lopez, whose life had been silenced in 1984, that revolution would come slowly. But it would come. By 2002, Detective Laura Benton had earned a reputation inside the Pinal County Sheriff's Office for persistence. She was methodical, sharp, and unwilling to let unsolved cases drift entirely into obscurity. Benton had joined the force too late to work Maria's case firsthand, but she knew it well. One late evening, while reviewing cold files stacked on her desk, she pulled Maria's folder. The black and white crime scene photos, the yellowing reports, the tired signatures of long-retired detectives, all of it stared back at her. She was just my age when she died, Benton would later reflect. I couldn't stop thinking, if it had been me, if it had been my family, would they still be waiting? Would they still hope? Benton began lobbying her supervisors to reopen the case. She argued that the blouse, the beer bottle, even the trace fibers could yield answers under modern testing. Her request was approved, though resources were limited. The first box Benton opened was Maria's clothing. Still sealed, the blouse and skirt had been carefully preserved. Benton sent them to the state crime lab in Phoenix, requesting DNA analysis. At the time, technology was not as sensitive as it would become a decade later, but analysts were able to extract a partial DNA profile from skin cells along the waistband of Maria's skirt. It wasn't enough for a match. But it was enough to prove one thing: there was foreign male DNA present. Someone other than Maria had touched her clothing the night she died. The beer bottle, too, was tested. The degraded print was reanalyzed with digital enhancement software, a tool unavailable in 1984. Though still incomplete, the print showed more detail than before. Analysts compared it against state databases. No match. For Benton, the results were bittersweet. Evidence existed, but the answers remained out of reach. Cold case work often means retracing the steps of those who walked the path before you. Benton tracked down witnesses from 1984, classmates, neighbors, even the supermarket clerk who had reported seeing Maria in the parking lot. The memories had blurred with time. Some could recall nothing. Others misremembered details. A few provided small consistencies. Maria had seemed cautious that night, perhaps uneasy, though no one could say why. Then there was Daniel Harper. Benton visited Harper, now in his 40s, living in a modest rental house in Mesa. He had never left the area. His pickup was long gone, replaced with an aging sedan. Harper agreed to speak. He insisted, as always, that he had nothing to do with Maria's death. But Benton noticed his unease, the way he wrung his hands, his quick glances to the window. When asked if he would voluntarily provide a DNA sample, Harper hesitated. He eventually agreed, though he complained about the intrusion. His sample was sent to the lab. Weeks later, results returned. Harper's DNA did not match the partial profile recovered from Maria's skirt. For Benton, it was a moment of clarity. The man long suspected by many, the awkward classmate, the uneasy loner, was not the killer. He was a red herring, one that had cost investigators precious time in 1984. By the late 2000s, DNA technology was advancing rapidly. Low copy number (leucine) analysis could now work with smaller samples, detecting profiles invisible to earlier methods. National databases were expanding, storing profiles of not just convicted offenders but also arrestees in many states. Benton pushed for Maria's evidence to be retested using these new methods. In 2009, the blouse was re-examined, and this time, analysts were able to extract a fuller male profile from a mixture of cells. It was uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. Weeks passed. The months. No match appeared. The frustration was sharp, but Benton knew the value of the profile. Once it's in the system, she explained, it's like a beacon. The day someone makes a mistake, the day someone's DNA hits the database, we'll know. When Rosa and Enrique Lopez were informed that new DNA evidence had been recovered, they wept. For decades, they had lived with silence, told repeatedly that there was nothing more to be done. Now, even without a match, there was hope. Sophia, now in her 30s and a mother herself, attended one of Benton's briefings. She later described the feeling as bittersweet, like someone had reopened a wound, but at least they weren't ignoring it anymore. The Lopez family began speaking publicly again. Local news outlets ran features on cold cases being revived by DNA technology. Maria's photo, once faded from public memory, appeared on screens across Arizona once more. Despite the progress, Maria's killer remained unidentified. Somewhere, perhaps in Arizona, perhaps beyond, a man who had strangled a young woman in the desert walked free. He might have built a life, started a family, aged into obscurity. That knowledge haunted Benton. The case, though no longer cold, simmered in limbo. Detectives now had more than ever before, but still not enough to close it. The desert, as always, kept its silence. By 2010, Maria's case had sat unsolved for 26 years. But the DNA profile, preserved in CODIS, was waiting. It was only a matter of time. The past had not vanished. It had simply been biding its time, waiting for science, waiting for fate, waiting for the smallest of mistakes to pull a killer's name from the shadows. And when that mistake finally came, it would send shockwaves through the very neighborhood Maria once called home. For nearly 3 decades, the name Maria Lopez had lived in limbo. Her photograph, a smiling young woman with long dark hair, had been clipped into folders, pinned on cork boards, and tucked into the shoebox her father kept at home. Detectives came and went. Leads flickered, then vanished. And yet the truth remained elusive. By the early 2010s, hope rested on one thing. The DNA profile entered into CODIS. It was like a fishing line cast into an ocean of millions, waiting for the day the right fish swam by. Detective Laura Benton kept Maria's file on her desk even as she worked other cases. Whenever CODIS alerts came through the system, she checked them obsessively, half expecting, half dreading that Maria's case might finally break. It was like a ticking clock, Benton later said. We all knew one day, somehow, someone would slip. And when they did, Maria's case would finally speak again. The years dragged. CODIS hit after CODIS turned out to be irrelevant. Maria's DNA profile sat quietly in the system, a digital fingerprint searching for its mate. In 2015, a partial hit surfaced. A man in New Mexico arrested for burglary carried a DNA sequence that bore resemblance to the unknown profile from Maria's skirt. It wasn't a match, more like a faint echo. Analysts concluded it was a familial connection. For Benton, this was revolutionary. Familial DNA searching was controversial but increasingly used to find suspects through relatives. If the burglar was related to Maria's killer, investigators might trace the family tree backward to the source. The suspect's name was Victor Ramirez, a 32-year-old with a string of petty crimes. He had no connection to Arizona in 1984. But when detectives dug deeper, they discovered his father had lived in Mesa during the 1980s. Victor's father was Thomas Ramirez, a quiet man who had worked odd construction jobs in Phoenix during the early 80s before moving his family to New Mexico. Benton's team pulled records. In 1984, Thomas drove a dark-colored van, consistent with the vague witness descriptions from the supermarket lot. He also had a minor criminal record: disorderly conduct, public intoxication. Nothing violent, but enough to raise questions. More striking, Thomas Ramirez's age in 1984, 26, matched the profile of the likely offender. Detectives knew they needed his DNA. But Thomas was elusive. He had relocated several times, drifting between New Mexico and Texas. In 2016, Benton obtained a warrant and arranged for a surreptitious collection. Officers followed Ramirez, retrieving a discarded coffee cup from a gas station trash can. When the lab results came back, the tension was palpable. Benton recalled holding her breath as the analyst read the report. It was a match. The DNA on Maria Lopez's skirt, preserved for over 30 years, belonged to Thomas Ramirez. The news hit like a thunderclap. Ramirez had never been a suspect in 1984. His name appeared nowhere in the original file. Yet the science was undeniable. In 2017, detectives traveled to confront Ramirez in New Mexico. He was now a graying man in his late 50s, working sporadically and living with a second wife. When they knocked on his door, he looked bewildered. Inside the interrogation room, Benton laid the evidence out plainly. "We have your DNA on Maria Lopez's clothing. It places you at the scene. You cannot explain that away." Ramirez denied everything. He insisted he had never met Maria, had never been in Apache Junction. He claimed the DNA evidence was rigged or mistaken. But the match was irrefutable. In early 2018, after months of legal wrangling, a Pinal County grand jury indicted Thomas Ramirez for the 1984 murder of Maria Lopez. News of the arrest spread swiftly through Phoenix. For those who remembered Maria's case, it was surreal. After decades of silence, her killer had a name, a face, and handcuffs around his wrists. Maria's family, now much older, gathered at the press conference. Rosa, her mother, clasped a rosary in her hands. Her voice shook as she said, "We prayed for this day, even when it felt impossible. Maria can finally rest." Her father, Enrique, said little. Tears welled in his eyes as he held up a photo of Maria, worn at the edges from years of carrying it in his wallet. The arrest sent ripples through the very community where Maria once lived. Many neighbors remembered the fear of 1984. Some had long assumed the killer was Harper, the awkward classmate who'd been questioned repeatedly. To learn it was a stranger, someone who had slipped past unnoticed, was unsettling. One former classmate told reporters, "All these years we thought we knew. Turns out we didn't know anything. He was a ghost right next to us." Ramirez's defense attorneys fought aggressively. They questioned the chain of custody of the evidence, arguing that 30-plus years in storage left room for contamination. They criticized the use of familial DNA, calling it unreliable. But prosecutors had the match. The statistical odds of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Ramirez were astronomical. What they lacked, however, was a clear motive. Ramirez had no known connection to Maria. He hadn't attended her college. He wasn't part of her social circle. He was, it seemed, a predator who happened upon her by chance. Prosecutors argued that Maria had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, targeted by Ramirez as she left the diner. He may have coerced her into his van, driven her into the desert, and killed her to silence her. For Benton, the arrest was both triumphant and sobering. Catching him was a victory, she said, but it didn't erase the years Maria's family lived without answers. It didn't give her back her life. Still, justice, though delayed, was finally in sight. By 2018, Phoenix had changed beyond recognition. Yet the Lopez case, frozen in time since 1984, forced the community to confront its history. It reminded people of a night when fear had settled over their streets, when a young woman's life was stolen without explanation. Now, with Ramirez behind bars, the desert's silence had finally been broken. But the trial was still ahead. And with it, the question that had lingered for decades. Could justice, arriving 34 years late, still feel like justice? The arrest of Thomas Ramirez in 2018 sent shockwaves through Arizona. For 34 years, the murder of Maria Lopez had remained a painful mystery. Now, with Ramirez in custody, the community braced itself for the final chapter, the trial. Trials in cold cases are complicated. Time erodes evidence, witnesses forget, and defense attorneys attack the gaps left by history. Yet prosecutors believed the DNA evidence, coupled with circumstantial support, was strong enough to secure a conviction. From the moment Ramirez was indicted, his defense mounted a fierce campaign. They argued that the chain of custody on Maria's blouse and skirt could not be trusted after 3 decades. Boxes, they said, could be tampered with. DNA could be contaminated. They also challenged the use of familial DNA searching, the very method that had first linked Ramirez to the case through his son. Defense attorneys claimed it was an invasion of privacy, a fishing expedition that unfairly targeted Ramirez simply because of his genetics. The prosecution countered that the evidence had been stored under strict protocols, the chain of custody meticulously documented. The DNA profile from Maria's skirt matched Ramirez to near certainty, a 1 in several trillion probability of it belonging to anyone else. After months of wrangling, the judge ruled the DNA evidence would be admissible. In the spring of 2019, jury selection began at the Pinal County Courthouse. Prospective jurors were asked if they remembered the case from news coverage in the 1980s. A surprising number did. Some admitted they had long assumed the weird classmate, Daniel Harper, was guilty. Those with strong preconceived notions were dismissed. The final panel consisted of 12 jurors and 2 alternates, men and women ranging in age from mid-20s to 60s. Many had not been alive in 1984. For them, Maria's story was history. The prosecution's opening statement was direct and emotional. In 1984, Maria Lopez was a 21-year-old college student with dreams of becoming a teacher. She never came home. Her life was stolen, her family shattered. For decades, the case was cold. But today, with science and persistence, we can finally show you who killed her, the defendant, Thomas Ramirez. The defense, in contrast, urged skepticism. This is a case built on old boxes and degraded samples. 34 years have passed. Memories are gone. Evidence has sat in storage. And yet the state wants you to believe they can prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that my client, a man with no connection to Maria Lopez, is guilty. Ladies and gentlemen, doubt is everywhere in this case. Prosecutors built their case meticulously. DNA evidence. Experts explained how skin cells recovered from Maria's skirt matched Ramirez. Charts and statistical probabilities underscored the certainty. Witness testimony. Though memories had faded, witnesses from 1984 recounted the night Maria disappeared, the supermarket lot, the argument overheard, the description of a van or truck. These details aligned with records showing Ramirez owned a dark van in 1984. Behavioral patterns. Prosecutors highlighted Ramirez's history of alcohol abuse and disorderly conduct, painting him as volatile. They suggested Maria resisted his advances, leading to her murder. The defense countered relentlessly. They brought in their own experts to question DNA degradation, suggesting the sample could have been contaminated. They emphasized the lack of motive. Ramirez had no personal connection to Maria, no history of violence toward women. For Maria's family, attending the trial was excruciating. Rosa clutched a rosary each day, whispering prayers as evidence photos were shown. Enrique sat stiffly, his hands folded, his eyes rarely leaving Ramirez. Maria's siblings, now middle-aged, spoke outside the courthouse. "We've waited our entire lives for this," said Sophia. "It doesn't bring Maria back, but it matters. It matters that her killer is named." The jury watched the family closely. Their grief was palpable, their decades of waiting woven into every sigh and tear. Midway through the trial, prosecutors introduced a surprise witness, a woman named Angela Torres, who had known Ramirez in the mid-1980s. Angela testified that Ramirez often drank heavily and became aggressive. Once, she recalled, he bragged about getting away with something bad in Arizona, though she admitted she hadn't known what he meant at the time. The defense pounced, calling her memory unreliable after 30 years. But her testimony added an unsettling dimension, a hint that Ramirez had carried his secret for decades, unburdened until DNA exposed him. By the end of 2020, both sides delivered closing arguments. The prosecution. The desert may hide secrets, but it cannot erase the truth. Maria Lopez's killer left behind his trace, and science has revealed it. Do not let him escape justice again. After 36 years, let Maria's family hear the words they've waited for: guilty. The defense. This case is built on sand. 36 years later, we are asked to trust evidence that could not be verified, witnesses whose memories have crumbled, and assumptions about a man who never knew Maria Lopez. You must hold the state to its burden, and that burden is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In March 2021, the jury deliberated for 2 days. The Lopez family sat in the front row as the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Ramirez, guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps filled the courtroom. Rosa wept openly, Enrique burying his face in his hands. Benton, seated behind the prosecution, closed her eyes in relief. After 37 years, justice had finally spoken. Ramirez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed little emotion, staring blankly as the judge delivered the sentence. For the Lopez family, the moment was bittersweet. Maria's life could never be returned. But her name was no longer tied to silence. It was tied to justice. "We've waited almost 4 decades, Enrique said outside the courthouse. "Now, at last, we can say Maria's story has an ending." The trial underscored the power of perseverance. Without Benton's determination, without advancements in DNA technology, Ramirez might never have faced accountability. The Lopez case became a symbol across Arizona, proof that cold cases could be solved even after decades. It also sparked renewed interest in other unsolved murders from the 1980s, many of which were reopened for DNA testing. The conviction of Thomas Ramirez in 2021 marked the end of a decades-long nightmare for the Lopez family. Yet as the court emptied and the news cameras packed away, the story did not fade. Instead, it echoed across Arizona, leaving behind questions, lessons, and a renewed determination to confront the ghosts of unsolved crimes. For Rosa and Enrique Lopez, the trial's conclusion was both a relief and a reckoning. They had spent nearly 4 decades living in the shadow of their daughter's murder. Now, with Ramirez behind bars, they faced a different challenge: how to live without the weight of the unknown. Rosa continued to attend Mass daily. Parishioners noticed a change in her demeanor. She was still solemn, but there was a lightness in her step, a sense that she had laid down part of the burden she had carried for so long. Enrique, long the quieter mourner, began to speak more openly about Maria. He shared stories of her childhood with his grandchildren, who had grown up knowing their aunt only through faded photographs. "Justice doesn't erase the pain," he admitted in an interview. "But it gives us permission to remember her with love instead of only grief." Maria's siblings found their own ways of healing. Sophia, who had spent years resenting the way her sister's absence overshadowed her own life, finally felt closure. She began volunteering with organizations supporting families of homicide victims, helping others endure what she had once believed was unendurable. Maria's case had never truly left the community where she grew up. Older residents remembered the fear that gripped the neighborhood in 1984, the whispered warnings about a killer on the loose. When Ramirez was finally named, many were stunned to learn he had been a stranger, not the awkward classmate, not someone within their circle, but a drifter who slipped into their lives and vanished just as quickly. The realization sparked uncomfortable conversations. If Ramirez could go unnoticed, how many others had escaped accountability? How many cold cases still linger in Arizona's deserts and cities? Local media revisited other unsolved homicides from the 1980s and 1990s. Families of missing women came forward, demanding that their loved ones' cases also be re-examined with modern technology. Maria's story, tragic as it was, became a rallying cry. For the Pinal County Sheriff's Office, the Lopez case became a case study in perseverance. Training programs for new detectives now include a module on cold case methodology, using Maria's file as an example of how evidence preservation and DNA technology could transform the trajectory of justice. Detective Laura Benton, who had fought so hard to reopen the case, became a prominent voice in the field. She spoke at conferences, urging departments never to underestimate the power of stored evidence. "Every box in a storage room is a voice waiting to be heard," Benton told one audience. "The desert may keep its secrets, but science can still make them speak." Benton's advocacy also helped secure new funding for Arizona's Cold Case Task Force. By 2023, the task force had reopened dozens of unsolved murders, some dating back as far as the 1970s. Inside prison, Thomas Ramirez maintained his innocence, despite the DNA match. He filed appeals, arguing procedural errors and contamination claims. Each was denied. His cellmates described him as withdrawn, rarely speaking, often staring blankly at the wall. For Maria's family, his denial mattered little. What mattered was that he could no longer hurt anyone else. "He can say whatever he wants," Rosa said when asked about Ramirez's continued claims. "The truth is in the evidence. And the truth is where my daughter finally found her justice." Nearly 40 years after her death, Maria Lopez's story continues to resonate. Community colleges across Arizona have hosted panels on campus safety, using her case as a reminder of the vulnerabilities students face. At Mesa Community College, where Maria had studied, a scholarship was established in her name. It supports first-generation college students pursuing degrees in education, the career path Maria herself had dreamed of. The scholarship was first awarded in 2022. The recipient, a young woman named Daniela, wrote in her application essay, "Maria Lopez's life was cut short, but her dream of teaching continues through those of us who carry her name forward in our studies." Maria's case also helped highlight the importance of cold case awareness nationwide. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials revisited her story, emphasizing the combination of persistence and technology that had cracked it open. For families still waiting, Maria's case offered hope. It proved that even after decades, even when memories had faded and suspects had aged, justice was possible. One victim's mother wrote to the Lopez family after the trial, "Your Maria gives me strength. If your daughter's voice was finally heard after 37 years, maybe my daughter's will be too." The desert wash where Maria's body was found remains unchanged in many ways. The mesquite trees still bend in the wind, the sand still shifts with each storm. Yet the site has become a quiet memorial. People leave flowers, crosses, and small stones painted with Maria's name. For Rosa, visiting the site is no longer just about grief. It is about remembering. "This place used to be only sadness for me," she said. "Now I come here and I feel peace." The desert couldn't keep its silence forever. As of 2025, Maria's case is considered closed. Ramirez remains in prison, appeals exhausted. The Lopez family continues to heal, finding ways to celebrate Maria's life instead of only mourning her death. But her story endures, woven into the fabric of Arizona's history. It is a reminder of what time can take, but also what it can give back. It is a testament to the persistence of family, the progress of science, and the unrelenting search for justice. Maria Lopez was more than a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Her life was stolen, but her memory has shaped change far beyond her own story.